St. Peter's is in the process of possibly hiring a new rector. While I was there briefly for the initial interview, I I was given an aha moment in that process, and that aha moment is that the situation that St. Peter's finds itself in is roughly analogous to something historical from the 19th century. That is, I was thinking specifically of the very great man, Frederick Denison Maurice, spelled like Maurice, but you know, the English, they don't pronounce French words quite right. F.D. Maurice, his bona fides, if you will, I mean, he was an Anglican priest. He was thought to be inspiration for the re-energization of hospice. He had some effect on Jane Addams and the Settlement House Company, and as I look at it, I think he might have been a little bit of an influence on Dorothy Day and the Catholic Workers' Party, among others. In the early 20th century, most Anglican, that is, English, British clergy were what we would now call social democrats. In those days, they were democratic socialists. Even though they served largely the Tory party at prayer, as it has been called, the Church of England. Anyway, Maurice was born in the early 19th century. He lived well into the 1870s, and he had an interesting place in a rather busy time. We don't think of it much, but in the 19th century, the early 19th century, the evangelicals pretty much ran things. They were the largest party. They had many members in the parliament. William Wilberforce, who was an evangelical, was instrumental in getting rid of slavery, and so there was a lot of influence from the evangelicals. In the 1840s, the Oxford movement was a sort of Catholic reaction to the influence of evangelicals. Now, evangelicalism was a little different back then, not terribly different, but somewhat different than it is today. The issues, of course, are similar and different. But Maurice found himself sort of in between the sort of Catholicity of somebody like John Henry Newman on the one hand, and the evangelicals on the other side of him. He was pretty much a conformist, even though he started life as I think a Unitarian, and he evolved into a conformist, meaning he accepted the ascendancy of the Anglican Church and eventually was ordained in it. However, he was something of a rebellious conformist. He, as you can tell from his bona fides, that he was an interesting person. I was thinking about this in particular because St. Peter's finds itself in an interesting place. It has resources, it has money, it has endowment, it has buildings, it has a very small congregation, very committed. But what does it take to rejuvenate this? Demographics of the county have changed quite a bit, and the relationship of Harrisonville to Kansas City and to the diocese has changed. And so what can be done to, reform and make this congregation grow to something of its former self? 30 years ago, there were probably 60 to 80 people on any given Sunday, which nicely fills the space. Since then, there have been conflicts within the community and lots of other changes, and so gradually the congregation has dwindled. But what can be done to grow it? Now, if you focus just on growth, it won't grow. You have to grow for some reason. You have to have a purpose, a mission. What F.D. Maurice provided for his people and his time was a specific mission. He wasn't, on the one hand, the Oxford movement raised up to, as a Catholic counterweight to all of the evangelicalism that was part of the English scene at the time. But then John Henry Newman and several others went to Rome, and that was pretty much the end of that movement. So what can be done to grow a community? Now, F.D. Maurice obviously had charisma, or maybe not obviously, but he did have charisma, and he was thought a particularly great preacher. He thought John Henry Cardinal Newman was kind of hollow in his writings. He wasn't writing to the reality of life. He was writing to the rules of the Roman Church. And on the other hand, evangelicals were not really didn't take seriously the sacraments. And Maurice was very much about the sacraments. He was, as his biographer, here's his book, Olive Rose. As you can see, rebellious conformist from 1805 to 1872. Now, during that time, he had a number of different things that he did that made him both a conformist and someone who, as we would say nowadays, thought outside the box. The thing is, the new rector for St. Peter's needs to be somebody who is sort of theologically energized. There are a lot of different things that energize us in the world, but theology is not very common at the moment. The evangelistic folk of the day have sort of a negative reputation for their particular motivations, and actually so does the Roman Church. It's more about not what they allow, but what they don't allow. The Roman Church has been big on anti-abortion kind of stuff, and many evangelicals agree with that. But I'm not so sure that that the theological justifications and the intellectual justifications for that are very clear. Sure, murder is murder, but people need to have realistic choices for their lives, and the church cannot dominate the choices of people who are not part of the church. At least it should not. And unfortunately, people want to use law to force people to do things that they might not want to do. That sense of authority is both on the Catholic side and on the evangelical side. But Maurice was in the middle and didn't see these things so much as a problem of authority as a problem of history. So I'm thinking about Maurice's example as something that St. Peter's might want to think about. What I mean by that is that the rector who is going to enliven the congregation and grow it will be somebody who is theologically, ideologically, and otherwise active, passionate. This is not a slot to fill. This is because most of the people who would fill it, most of the Episcopal Church priests I know, have been maintainers. I myself am pretty much a maintainer, although mine is more oriented toward helping out those congregations with problems. But still, many of us are not very well equipped for the kinds of issues that St. Peter's faces. And if you want to look at the wider church, probably what the wider church faces too. You know, those places that have a theologically energetic leadership, they do just fine. They're doing the gospel. And that's what St. Peter's needs to do, doing the gospel. And I think Frederick Denison Maurice will be, is a great example from the 19th century of how you passionately understand life and work toward what needs to be. Well, anyway, I think we can't take history and just put it on ourselves. We have to just use it as a model for thinking about the future. But that model would tell me that we don't need to focus so much on growth as we need to focus on the renewal of the community through passionate understanding of what God is calling forth from us. So, that's what I have to say this week.